All right. Well, our topic for today is myths and misconceptions about evolutionary psychology, which unfortunately is a very large topic because there are lots of myths and misconceptions, and at least in my experience, both professionally and personally, often encounter a lot of resistance to evolutionary psychology, sometimes based on those myths and misconceptions. And rather than do what I usually do and do an introduction, I mean, I could do one if you wish, but I thought I would forego that today because I think most of you are probably familiar enough with evolutionary psychology and the literature that we could just jump right in and talk about what your personal experiences have been, either professionally uh, or personally, when you try to talk about certain aspects of Ev Psych and you run into a brick wall of resistance, or you run into people that have misconceptions about Ev Psych but are still resistant when you attempt to disabuse them of those misconceptions. And I suppose the other question would be, in doing some of the readings for today, were there any myths and misconceptions you yourself might have held, or at least residually held, that got clarified a bit when you did some of the readings? So I will just toss it open, and hopefully we can have a friendly and interesting discussion about what our experiences have been um, as proselytizers for this view of life, if you will. So who would like to jump in? No takers?
Well, I'll speak, but I'm not jumping in. This is kind of I'm not immersed in the evolutionary biology or psychology. So a lot of it is just kind of really learning and uptaking and downloading the information. So just to tell you that, but I do have a question that I didn't get a chance to look it up. But what are the I was just reviewing one of the articles talks about uh, adaptation, byproducts, and noise.
Right.
Okay, that was in one of the articles. And what are the other? There was the three that David Sloan Wilson talks about. The three uh, what is it? It's variation. What are the
Selection
three?
and retention.
That's it. That's just you see where I'm going. I can't even remember that, and I have a good memory, but that's when I start something.
Well, it's ironic that the word you forget is retention, but
Well, I'm retaining, not remembering.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So that's just to start.
Well, and I think, Hank, you might be selling yourself a little bit short. You've been coming to these discussions for at least a year, if not longer.
Longer,
So
yeah.
so you're rapidly losing the defense of being a complete neophyte when it comes to thinking in this way. But
Well, considering who I hang out with, mostly therapists, I am the genius. I mean, there's very little in
mhm.
my part of the world here, and of course it's national and international, but so little is talked about. And I've been in this field almost 45 years.
Well,
And
you're absolutely correct and we have done a session on applied evolutionary psychology, if you will. I think we
right.
called it Genes on the Couch, and it was about
Hmm.
evolutionary psychiatry. But I do think that among psychologists, and I'm a retired psychotherapist myself, among applied psychologists, they're not trained in this. They're not taught about this. They don't even get courses in basic evolutionary theory, never mind evolutionary psychology. So
Yeah.
the average clinician in the mental health world
Nope.
tends not to know a lot about
Yeah.
the field of psych. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah. By the way,
But
I
yep, go
somebody
ahead.
wanted.
No, that was me. Go ahead.
Oh, I just finished reading a piece that Diane Sunar wrote. I don't know if we've ever discussed it here, but it's an old paper she wrote on sort of revising the psychology of morality. I don't know
Hmm.
if we've seen it here. I know I asked her to send it to me once, and I just got done doing a pretty thorough skim, and she does a lot. It's older, but she does a lovely integration of the different facets. About talking about morality in terms of psychoanalytic theory, learning theory, the neurobiology of the brain, and so that
Hmm.
does a nice, and it's very readable. So it does a nice overview. So I thought she might be here, and I thought
Yeah, me
maybe she
too.
might, yeah. So I thought
Mm.
maybe she could impose on her to maybe do a talk on her paper. I mean, it's
Well,
very good.
let's come back to that at the end, but let's stay with our topic of the
Yeah.
day. Um, Kathleen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but and feel free to decline this, but you've shared before some brick walls, if you will, that you've encountered, I think, professionally in t talking about or I don't know if proselytizing is the right word, but sharing your thoughts and interests in evolutionary psychology. I don't know if you'd be willing to
Sure.
because I think they're quite typical, Kathleen. So that's why I ask.
I didn't do the readings for today, so I'm sorry. I barely managed to come here today.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, over the years things have changed, but I guess I think my initial interest in evolutionary psychology, I think like so many of us, we had these personal situations, or we were able to link something that interested us on more of a emotional or professional kind of interest. And that was my case. And one of the things I got very interested in was self-deception. And it became apparent to me as I tried to share what I was discovering was that there was a lot of self-deception in the way people responded to either the field or my take on the field, which of course led me to consider the degree to which I might have been motivated by various unconscious concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, coming from French studies, I'm in the humanities, and in French particularly,
Mm,
people were heavily invested in the powerful influence of stories and culture on
Mm-hmm.
human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw evolutionary approaches as antithetical to that.
mm.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Wow.
and I, in the late 90s, which is when I got really interested in it, there wasn't as much either available to me on the role of stories and storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
because most of my acquaintances who were in evolutionary psychology were not really doing that, or it was kind of a side thing for them. And so long story short, I was treated with suspicion and worse by people in feminist and gender studies. And then when it came to evolutionary psychologist, I felt as if my perspective as a woman should have been better understood. I even remember writing to Steven Pinker after I read one of his books and shared my views on what I thought was, it had to do with rape and the things he was saying about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like he was missing a lot of things. He actually wrote back and told me to continue. So it was a nice experience in that way. But the feeling I had was that I had to keep telling a lot of men, it's not that, or it's not the way you seem to be taking it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking a lot, sorry.
Well, that I think the issue you're raising is that one of the things that evolutionary psychology goes against, if you will, is a kind of dominant paradigm that's existed in the social sciences and the humanities, at least in my professional lifetime, which I'm going to call the social constructivist paradigm, which is a fancy way of kind of referring to the notion of the mind being tabula rasa, blank slate. And of course, famously, Pinker's book was called The Blank Slate.
That was the book I read and wrote to him
Right.
about.
The subtitle of which I think is better than the title. And the subtitle of that book is The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And so the reason I think that there's a lot of resistance in the social sciences and humanities to anything that challenges that is out of a fear that if the mind comes, well, they think we're saying it comes hardwired, and it doesn't come hardwired. It comes pre-wired with certain
Pre-war.
with certain inclinations and dispositions. That's not quite the same as hardwired. My favorite quote on that, Jonathan Haidt cites
Right.
Jonathan Haidt cites someone in The Righteous Mind, and the quote is that the mind um, comes organized in advance of experience, um, which is, I think, a nice way of putting it. But at any rate, it challenges the view um, that people can change. At least that's how it's misinterpreted. And I think that there's a fear that evolutionary psychology is either going to say that, make the naturalistic fallacy and say that what is ought to be, or that somehow it's going to entrench patriarchy and sexual stereotypes and things of that nature. And so it's I think met with a lot of resistance from people that want the world to be different than it is, which I would include most evolutionary psychologists. My argument to that would be, if you want people to be different and you want the world to be better, you need to know what you're up against, and partly what you're up against is human nature. But now I'm on my soapbox a little bit. But so what else, Rob, have you run into in terms of people's misunderstandings?
I was just going to say that I'm either going to blame or credit Kathleen for a phrase that we came across in the reading, which was about the how and the why. And it's a question I now ask about everything. So how does evolution affect behavior, and why? And the why question is the hard one. So
Right,
it just set me off on a train of thought. I was also going to say that I've been having weekly conversations, usually about religion, with my college roommate who became a Jehovah's Witness. And he's very curious about evolution, and I give him lectures from my modest knowledge of the subject, and it just sails right by.
Hmm.
He doesn't argue with anything. It just, he'll just go on and continue talking about the inerrancy of the Bible.
Okay.
And I try to explain that Adam and Eve were probably not the first two people, because there were probably not two people. And
Yeah, you're raising a related issue, which is the resistance to the theory of natural selection, which is a little bit different and broader than the more narrow topic for today, which was resistance, misunderstandings about evolutionary psychology. There's of course overlap between the two, but I find a lot of people accept the theory of natural selection. They're not creationists. They're not anti-evolutionary science, but very resistant to evolutionary psychology, which is sort of a subset within evolutionary science. Hank.
well, he claims to
Oh,
not be
go ahead, Rob.
resistant.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Rob.
He claims to not be resistant to evolution and evolutionary theory.
Okay.
And at the same time, he doesn't see it. It's there's a kind of blindness, like face blindness. It's like the chimpanzee that lost her
It,
sight.
that's
Maybe
interesting.
could
So if
appreciate
you,
things without bumping into them, but couldn't
yeah,
see. Uh, to me, evolutionary psychology is at work here, and I'd like to know how that process works because I'm really curious by these conversations. They've been quite delightful because we were good friends, and we still have that contact. But his world is so different from mine.
hmm hmm
Uh,
let me go to Sage and then Hank.
okay.
Yeah, I think Rob, that's the why question. One of the sticking points, just as far as acceptability, is the explanations for evolutionary psychology and for the why does this thing exist is at the level of the genome or maybe the population, but it's usually generalized to like humankind. And I think we don't appreciate how broad that is, like the level, the similarities, how broad that is. And we over project that into our daily life. These are like much deeper kinds of things, even if they can be very hardwired, so to speak, like really strong behaviors that are coming that way. But I think people resist the explanations that come at that level of why question, that kind of ultimate evolutionary explanation, which has to do with, fitness at a fundamental level. And it sort of seems reductive. Um, but what is interesting is I'm always curious about how evolutionary psychologists and how people who follow it extend that wide down to lower levels. So then at the level of the genotype, and each one of us, our own genetic inheritance has a structural role, just like our genomic inheritance. But it's actually, and that I think is really where people resist. And I see studies coming out recently, and there's many of them about how much children's development really is explained by their genetics, inheritance, and their environment, immediate environment, their developmental context. But parenting styles matter much less than you think than the overall environment and their genetics. So that is like their genotype interacting with their environment to produce their phenotype. And so now we're at the level of behavioral variation. So two siblings can still be so different from each other and still share so much. So it's like I feel like there's that need to say like what level of similarity and difference, because when you look around and see everybody, we seem to be very different, very varied in a lot of ways, and we often don't appreciate almost the profoundness that we're not as different, nearly as different as we could be because of
Right.
how similar.
Two thoughts, Sage. I mean, one is I think what you're referring to is a fear of genetic determinism, which
Yeah.
which is really what I also was alluding to when I talked about um, how people in the social sciences that are constructivist in their ideology or in their paradigm, they also resist it for fear that what EvPsych is saying is that you don't have any elbow room to choose your behavior, which isn't an inaccurate reading of it. I think.
Well, yeah, I think that there's like the one more level that I didn't get to is the symbo type, which is our symbolic
Yeah.
thought, cultural evolution. And there is where the constructivist actually comes back around because now you have a different, you're creating the niche in which we're adapting. But um, I think I kind of resolve that in my head around like the why doesn't change. The why is a through line all the way up. And if you keep going, you'll go back to the genotype and the ancient planes of our existence. But the how is where it all is incredibly adaptive and incredibly variable to the point
Mhm.
that you can hold both of these things at the same time. Like, yes, we construct our environments, our immediate life is incredibly contextual and constructive. Um, but the why we do what we do, if you really thought about all the things we could be doing, why am I doing these things? It's like, right, yeah. So maybe we're a lot more similar in that way.
The last comment I was going to make, then, and then I'll go to Hank and then Kathleen. But the other thought I had as you were talking about Sage is how I think to some degree, EvPsych has a tendency to go against the current zeitgeist, if you will. And what I mean by that is that at least for the last 20 or 30 years, the social sciences have been fairly preoccupied with cultural difference and cultural diversity, for understandable reasons, both scientifically and politically. That's understandable. As our society
Mhm.
becomes more diverse, it went along with that. Whereas biological anthropology and to some degree evolutionary psychology has been more observed, more concerned with human universals.
Mhm.
What do we see that's the same across cultures? The metaphor I sometimes use is that um, different cultures are playing the same melody on different instruments.
Mhm.
And so what sometimes look like cultural diversity on the surface in terms of how a particular psychological adaptation or mechanism is expressed can be quite different, because circumstances on the ground are different. But if you go down a level and think about the sort of neurobiological cognitive mechanism, which is in a sense content free, that's quite similar. The prototypical example of this that's always used, of course, is language. Different cultures speak different languages, but that doesn't. But there's the underlying capacity for language is what's universally the
Mhm.
same. So I
Well,
think we've
yeah,
been out. The field is in that way out of step with sort of the cultural zeitgeist, if you will.
the other
Um,
the other way to phrase that, if we say how and why, and what you're saying, Steve, is also form and function. These are
yes,
all equivalency. And
yes.
so there is an arbitrary nature to form, you know,
Hmm.
and that's an interesting piece that's very similar to this discussion on evolutionary aesthetics that we were having.
Okay.
How that comes in.
Let me go to Hank and then Kathleen.
Okay, let's see. I want to try to get something complicated. A couple of things. Let me just throw out the term a desperate need for certainty to respond to Rob.
Hmm.
That's that's what came to mind. I know a few. I'm friendly with a few. Well, I've worked with a lot of religious people. I've taught clergy, but they're a little bit more flexible than the average person who's deeply devoted. But also, but when I've had discussion, this one fellow who's a Jehovah's Witness, that the ferocity of the need for certainty is just like, I just got to keep my mouth shut. Your friend sounds like maybe you could talk. And we're not close friends, but that's one. But I'm just wondering if this is a thought experiment. So I don't know if we're going to have discussion or not, but around this notion of certainty and uncertainty, how would we look at that from evolutionary psychology point of view? So, because when you we live in a society, and many societies, there's a certainty. The Bible says this. Donald Trump says this. This one says this, or we debunk it with certainty. Whatever people do, but what, like in Buddhism, there are thinkers who talk about not knowing is a virtue. And not knowing requires us to face some kind of existential danger or threat of uncertainty. And if you think about with my work, and I know Steve, you and others, we're around it all the time. And even though I can be not autocratic, but I can come across as sounding like I know everything sometimes in my area, which I have to be careful. I probably learned it from my mother, who didn't know that much anyway. But
Hank, let me
yeah,
translate what you're asking into an evolutionary psychology
great.
frame, because that's how you began. So
Yeah.
one way to say that is to what degree is tolerance is what is to what degree is tolerance for ambiguity adaptive? Is there a window in which too literal tolerance for ambiguity or excessive tolerance for ambiguity is maladaptive, and there's a sweet spot that actually enhances fitness? That would be a question an evolutionary psychologist could ask. It also illustrates another misconception about EvPsych, which is that it doesn't generate hypotheses and predictions and empirical research, which is not true. We could, if we wanted to, not that we will, but we could design a research project to answer the question that I'm posing in
Well,
some way.
Steve, can I just ask you to instead of using ambiguity, can we stay with uncertainty in this?
Sure, it's
Okay.
same
Yeah.
synonyms. Yes.
I just have a thing about being a little more specific about, since uncertainty is some kind of universal concern, ambiguity. Some of us know what that means, but
You want us to be less ambiguous about
yes.
ambiguity. So, okay.
And I don't know if we can define uncertainty. I'm not sure that's our job. Somebody could write a paper on it, and some people have, but it's a great way to put it. I don't know. Can we discuss that a little bit so we can learn about this
Sure.
in a very practical way? Like,
So what do people think about that question in terms of tolerance for ambiguity and to what degree that enhances fitness? And Scott and Luke would love to hear from you guys.
Well, I guess chipping in here as a neophyte and somebody that probably is not a good fit in many ways, but so one thing that I would come back to with certainty is Nagel's statement, something to the effect that we have this compelling need for a final reckoning. So that seems to be just a common theme. Now, why that is from an evolutionary standpoint, which I think is where you guys are all going or coming from, I wouldn't be able to say, but I think it's safe to conclude that it really applies to damn near everybody. We all have a tendency to want to be certain. And some people, like this group, I'm guessing, recognize that and try to avoid doing that, but others don't. And so they just fall right into whatever sometimes really stupid perspectives they have, and they're quite certain about it.
By final reckoning, can you define a little bit what you mean by that term?
Well, those were his words.
Okay.
That I'm just saying that Nagel and in a whole construct there that's quite off of what we're talking about. You're talking about here.
What does he mean by it?
He's I believe, I can't really speak from completely, is just talking about the need to have a construct about the world that you are certain about, that you can't live with, well, I just don't know. And there are all of these competing facts, competing interpretations, a lot of competition for conclusions. And so many of us, like me in particular, I mean, we go, well, we really just can't say. We can probably, I do, say it's not going to be just this. But that leaves us with a whole bunch of other stuff. Most people tend to go, well, it is just this. The Bible is inerrant, full stop.
Well, that's interesting. I just have to share real quickly. When you guys are done with this, you should go on YouTube and search for a folk song by Iris DeMint called "Let the Mystery Be," in which she sings about being content with ambiguity and to not know about what the final reckoning will bring. And she says that she's just content to let the mystery be, which is it was a theme song used in the HBO series The Leftovers, if anybody has seen that. But I think Luke and then Kathleen.
So the question was like, what is the evolutionary advantage of uncertainty? Is that the correct framing?
Well, to what is is tolerance for uncertainty adaptive? And if so, in what way and to what degree?
And does it enhance
sense.
fitness? And does it enhance fitness? Sorry, but
right. That's what I mean by adaptive. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does make sense to a degree insofar as if you're uncertain about something that's not a pressing threat, then you're less likely to make an uninformed decision that would decrease your evolutionary prospects, I guess, if that makes sense, or your,
When you say it's not an immediate threat, it makes me think of the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes. People can become quite certain as threat gets closer.
Right. Yeah, so I don't know. I think they're like the way I see it, like kind of see the question is like I think being able to deal with uncertainty has an advantage when you have the luxury of being able to hold that uncertainty, I guess.
In what ways could being certain, whether it's in a dogmatic, the Bible is an errant way, or a quite liberal way of being certain, which is, well, I don't believe every word in the Bible, but I do believe that there's a God and an afterlife, right? And I'm certain of that. To what degree, in what way might evolutionary psychology explain how that could be helpful, how that could be adaptive? We'll get to you in a minute, Kathleen, but I wanted people's thoughts on that question.
You're asking tough questions, buddy.
One
That's
thought,
great.
does it have a social bonding kind of function that could make you part of a community of fellow believers? And is there an advantage to that? I mean, even atheists join societies of other atheists. So
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a thought. It's sort of the neurobiology of threat detection. For the ancients. Not in a modern city, but we go way back. And the negativity bias is something to do with threat detection. You're out in the jungle or in the woods somewhere, and you're alone, and you see a stick, or you don't know if it's a stick or a snake.
right.
And if you decide without double checking, you say, it's only a stick. And you pop over there, and the poisonous snake, zaps you.
Right. False
So
negatives and false positives have different costs to them.
right. So here there's that is not for evolutionary fitness when there's a certainty in that level, or you're certain it's a snake, and then you go, well, I'll throw a rock at it and get it out of my way. So I mean, that's what's coming to mind. But how does that, if it's a false negative, but that's a part of certainty, how is that adaptive?
What I think I hear you saying is that being uncertain about an imminent threat could be dangerous if the threat is really there. That uncertainty could make you hesitate enough that you might be somebody's meal. Let me go to Kathleen. She's been patiently waiting.
Actually, I forget what the hand raising means, because each time I raised my hand, it was the ongoing conversation and not what I initially was. But it fits in with the idea of certainty. I read somewhere, has anyone read this? There's a study that shows that concern for truth was far less influential on our evolution than our ability to argue well. And that, things like arguing for your interest, or like who's going to go first into a dangerous situation and arguing who should do it, that had a greater influence on our logical development than a concern for truth. And it seems like a concern for truth it would help if it could bolster your arguments.
Interesting.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know much about it, but I would agree somehow that arguing well, think of the law profession, think of debate, think of, rabbinical, theological arguments. There's, how many angels can, dance around on a pin, but it's usually what's at least evident to me. It's mostly arguing, and the concern for truth is a kind of I'll say, I never thought of it this way, but is a kind of a wishful myth or an adaptive fiction.
Right. Well, we've had another session, I think, on adaptive fictions, and that's an interesting topic as well, where evolution is not concerned really with whether or not you perceive the world veridically accurate.
Hmm.
You know, if you have a perceive it in a false way, but that false way enhances fitness, then that gets selected for. But
We
back to yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
just have this incredible ability to believe something when we're arguing, but not to believe it when it comes to applying it to what we're doing. And we can argue the heck out of something as to why someone else should go first into a dangerous situation. But then when it comes to making a decision for ourselves, be much more aware of the truth. I think Steven Pinker uses the example of people sharing in a tribe, but when times get rough, they're going to start hoarding things and hiding them from others. It's like we have that ability to do two things, to hold on to the truth and yet somehow forget it when it's in our interest in an argument.
Yes, and by the way, that's not to digress, but just as a quick parenthetical comment, I think another resistance that often happens to evolutionary psychology is that people misunderstand the notion of having a selfish gene as meaning that people are selfish. And I think that's a misunderstanding that happens, and we could talk about that as well. But Luke, go ahead.
Okay, let me see if I can formulate my idea well here. And this is totally just like speculative, not really very based off anything I've read. So I guess I'm curious if there is any research or writing that relates to this idea. But I wonder if being able to hold uncertainty and deal with uncertainty has a evolutionary advantage in terms of group selection. If that means the group is less likely to get in conflict about beliefs that aren't necessarily relevant to like the survival of the group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think that would be a testable hypothesis, that the relationship of tolerance for uncertainty to group cohesion. How do those two variables relate in some fashion?
So, Steve, just along those lines, in-group stuff, or what about in and out group stuff and uncertainty?
I'm uncertain what you're asking, Hank.
Yeah. In other
But
words,
I can tolerate it, so I'm okay.
You can tolerate it. Well, you just have to ask me to continue on until I've formulated. I started out with a basic premise and then get help to formulate it here because I'm not used to translating things into evolutionary biology, psychology, so it takes a while. If that's one of the basic evolutionary phenomenon, in-group and out-group, uncertainty about the out-group by the in-group is going to cause trouble for the in-group. Because
that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me that, and this would, this is not Ev Psych at all, but one of the more influential books I read as an undergraduate back in the late Pleistocene when dinosaurs roamed the earth, what was Eric Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, which he wrote shortly after World War II, I believe, it was his attempt to try to understand what happened to the German people and their adoption of fascism and Hitler. And the gist of it, at least as I remember it 50 years later, is that people get anxious when they have freedom, and some people want to escape from that anxiety by joining and subscribing to a particular religion or a particular ideology that often is very black and white and doesn't have any uncertainty and has an answer for everything. and that you can lower that kind of existential anxiety, but the price you pay to lower it is less freedom. So I that has always stayed with me as containing some kernels of wisdom, I thought, at least. Yeah, Hank, go ahead.
Well,
And then Hank, Kathleen, and then Rob.
okay. I'm reminded, going back to the Pleistocene, Eric Berne, the transactional analysis guy who was first a
Games people
psychoanalyst.
play. Yeah.
Yeah, games. Yeah. But he had an interesting premise, and he called it structure hunger. I don't know if anybody is familiar with his work, but he didn't suggest that it was a drive, like an instinct, but he was trying to play with the idea we all need structure. And I think we can see it as therapists. You see how people use excessive alcohol or gambling, or, I have my coffee with me. That's a little my structure. You're my little security blanket. But structure and certainty get confused. But structure is variable depending on the situation. But it's sort of, if you think of addictions as an excessive lack of capacity for efficacy and creating structure for oneself. Now,
Well,
I don't
and
know.
another way to think about it is like, when we talk about tolerance for certainty or tolerance for ambiguity, it's a person, you can think of it like a personality trait. And most personality traits are distributed on a bell curve. All right. And so you have most people are somewhere in the middle in terms of how they tolerate uncertainty. You have some people that tolerate it very poorly and they're at one tail end of the bell curve. Some people maybe tolerate it excessively, so that they're never, their life is always a question mark. They never have a period.
Right.
And that's at the other end of the bell curve. And then you could do research that relates that personality trait to functioning in different ways and see if how that personality trait relates to fitness in that sense. I think I said Kathleen and then Rob.
Yeah, I just think that we do have this, I think, evolved tendency to want to be in a group. And to be in a group is to adopt the group values, the group beliefs, the group ways of thinking. And I think Fromm's Escape from Freedom was really pointing to people's, the gap that was left when small communities became less important than an organized state. And also the rise of radio that suddenly made huge masses of people feel connected. And Hitler really exploited radio. Yep. So I think that when we talk about structure, it can be very much part of that need to feel that we're in a group, to feel like not every decision we make every time is all entirely on us, because the more decisions you have to make, the more anxiety you live with, the more choices you have. It sounds like a nice thing, we have so many choices, but it also creates anxiety. And so I think the drive for a group and the need for certainty are linked in the sense that we are looking to feel like part of our decisions we don't have to make because someone else is going to make them, or that there's a agreed upon way of doing things.
Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, you've been using the word variable a lot, and it strikes me that this is probably the most important word in this area we can use, because everything varies and it varies all the time. So tolerance for ambiguity is sometimes high and sometimes low, depending on all the other variables. And, it's Venn diagrams all the way up.
So you're making a really good point, which is I've been talking about it as a fixed trait in a way, whereas what may matter the most is flexibility about how much certainty you tolerate, depending on the context. Yeah.
And the mental immunity group, the idea of not declaring certainty is important.
Right, in the sense that
Yeah.
that one of the hallmarks of a scientific worldview is that all beliefs, all truths are provisional. Every belief is, every scientific fact is a provisional fact subject to revision if evidence suggests that it needs to change. Yes. Hank?
Yeah, in the neurobiology of the brain, where did I go to? There's a whole notion that the brain requires simplicity. Well, I don't know how to say it, but when it gets to complexity, you need the higher brain, you need the neocortex, but the lower or the more ancient or primitive parts of the brain, they want something simple. Is this a dog or a cat? So the way the more primitive but early layers of the brain influence the more later layers of the brain, like the neocortex and cognition, the neocortex doesn't operate in isolation. It's always influenced by the early layers, and one of them could be simplicity. So we go back to certainty. I don't know if we can equate the two, certainty and simplicity. But I was wondering, I don't know if we can do this today, or not to be political, but it is political. But the large grouping that's following their fearless leader in what Trump as a human being represents in what's called the collective unconscious, or the collective group fantasy of some thinkers about it. So in terms of how is that adaptive in terms of evolutionary psychology, you got one big in-group that is certain, like the judges in Colorado their lives have been threatened because they said that they ruled that Trump couldn't take part of the election. But from an evolutionary biology point of view, is that evolutionary fitness? You've got an
I think we're
in-group.
talking about tribalism, which is we've drifted relatively far afield from the topic of today, but it's fine because it's been a pretty interesting conversation, even if it's been about some different things. But yeah, I don't think it's a stretch to figure out that as primates, we're a tribal creature, and we for most of human evolution, if you were not part of a tribe, you died. You couldn't survive on your own. So the impetus to be part of a tribe is I think pretty strong. The question is who joins what tribe and for what reason when it comes to political divisions within a particular larger tribe, right? We're all Americans, so we're part of that tribe, but we have sub tribes within it. I'm aware of our time, and we do try to make these an hour long, and so I wanted to toss it open to see if anybody has any suggestions for future topics for next month. And again, the way we have decided to structure this is that if you nominate a topic and it gets selected, you get the pleasure of selecting some readings and facilitating the conversation, or I can facilitate it for you if you don't want to do that. But and I don't want to put anybody on the spot. We can post our suggestions on Hilo afterwards in the next week or so. But I wanted to give people a chance if they have some topics that they're hungry to talk about. Rob?
Just struck me that talking about, because I'm involved in a group called the Future of Text, that the evolutionary impact of communication technologies, particularly writing, to start with, on evolution, on the both social and genetic evolution. It's a topic that would interest me.
Okay, all right.
Well, I'm sorry, but what would that sound like if we gave it a little title?
the well,
I know.
the impact of writing technology, the encoding of language in a visual form on society, on human development.
So the role of writing in human evolution is really what you're raising, I think.
Yeah, but how it changes the brain
Uh,
Yeah.
and how that
okay,
changes behavior.
Luke, you have a topic that's of interest?
Yeah, I have both a topic of interest, but also a more general question because I found out about this meeting from the Evolutionary Philosophy Circle post you made about it, Steve. But is
Yep.
there a high-low group or like an email list or something like that for this particular group?
Oh,
Should
Sage, you want to field that question?
yeah.
There is a Hilo group. I'll share the link in the chat so you can just click it and join.
I think
And
that last time I looked, there's about 45 people that are in that group that would get announcements about these meetings, right, Sage?
54.
54. Yeah.
But I recently read this article, or it's a pretty long like essay by the physicist David Deutsch called The Evolution of Culture, where he talks about uh, rational and anti-rational memes.
Mhm.
And it's just a really interesting sort of take on cultural evolution that might be interesting for this group.
Okay. Anyone else? And what I would suggest you guys do is flesh it out a little bit, and not a lot, but flesh it out a little bit and post it for the group in High Loaf, and people can kind of give a thumbs up or thumbs down to whether they have interest in that. I don't have anything particularly burning that I could suggest, but I probably could come up with a topic as well. Anybody else? Sage, how about you? Have anything you've been passionately interested in of late?
Well, one research area that we've been playing with is like we could concept idea around dual inheritance at the micro level. Um, so really thinking about what our genetic uh symbolic, and phenotype, the interactions, but within like a population. We've done a topic on dual inheritance, and like evolutionary psychology tends to be focused exclusively on very macro scale kinds of evolutionary stories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but playing into our discussion around more proximate causes. This kind of gets at this is the level where you can kind of see all three coming into play. That's a pretty broad topic. We could pin that down a bit, but there's,
Okay.
a lot of anthropology to look at there.
All three of these topics sound potentially interesting to me. I do think one of this group has been going on for about 3 years now. I think this was the very first group on ProSocial Commons that constituted itself or that began. And in a sense, we've sort of talked about a lot of what I might call the low-hanging fruit. We've talked a lot over the 36 or so meetings that we've held about a lot of the popular and things that come immediately to mind when you think about evolutionary psychology. And the one thing I would add is that it doesn't prohibit us from revisiting some of those topics as well. So you may want to take a look back, on the YouTube channel that Sage has. There's a couple of videos missing from that, Sage, that recent meetings, like the one on adaptive fictions is not there, I don't think.
Oh
And
yeah. Well, just to update there, I managed to locate it. It had been placed in a different spot of the YouTube, and since our playlist is unlisted, it was like kind of hidden.
got it,
So I found
got it.
that, and I found out that since the what we were calling the 36th session was actually the 35th. So we had
Oh,
our big 3-year congratulatories, but that wasn't it. So I've actually gone
Would-
back and updated all of those. There was like maybe 5 sessions that I had to shift back one and I've
Okay.
made the updates everywhere. So this is actually our 39th session.
I would say then that if we celebrated that early, we still celebrated it, so it was an adaptive fiction, Sage, right?
Steve,
That's good.
So
have
at
a-
any rate, feel free as well, to take a look back at some of the other topics we've talked about. And some of them may have been topics that were before you joined, as a particular individual. And there's no harm in going back and revisiting some of those topics as well as some new ones. Yeah.
I have a thought. Who is that? Kathleen?
Kathleen and Hank, Kathleen and Hank, yeah. Go ahead, Kathleen.
I was just saying we never exhaust any of them. I was just chiming in, not really.
Oh,
Kenneth has also suggested that we go back because he's come in later and going back to the archives. There's a lot there that he was interested in exploring. So,
okay,
yeah, I think that's all fair game.
okay. Hank?
Well, yeah, I'm paying a lot of attention to this, in terms of what Norman and the mental immunity. And there's another guy, Xander Van Leeuwen. That's what I was going to tell you about, Luke. I forget the name of his book, but he's a social psychologist who's written a book calling it something else. But
It's foolproof. Yeah,
that's
I've
right.
read
Oh,
about half
you've
of
seen it? You've seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been listening to. I don't know. I'm going to talk to you, Luke, but I can't get to post anything. I still haven't figured it out. Nobody's helped me. But I would love to send out the foolproof an interview that what's her name, Campbell. She's a brain science physician who runs the brain science thing. They do a very good job. But my thing now is again about misinformation, and I'm trying to think about it in terms of evolutionary psychology, and as how does misinformation contribute to evolutionary fitness?
Yeah. And I think that connects back to the topic of tribalism, because you tend to share belief in misinformation. Well, you don't perceive it as misinformation, but it's a shared belief. So what's interesting, Hank, is that if I believe that um, if I believe by myself as an individual that I've been possessed by an alien, um, you're going to might label me mentally ill as having a delusional or psychotic disorder. But if I'm part of a group of 50,000 people who believe that we all have been possessed by aliens, it's it's a religion.
So it's group cohesion,
Right.
tribalism, group cohesion.
But I think
With that,
tribalism would be an interesting topic. I think we've talked a little bit about that before. And we did just have a book club that I participated in on the book Our Tribal Future, which was a very interesting book about tribalism. But anyhow, if you have ideas, go ahead and post them. And then read them and vote if there's more than one. And I think today's conversation veered off the topic after the first 20 minutes or so, but what we ended up talking about in terms of the issue of tolerance for certainty and uncertainty was very, very interesting. Could have been an advertised topic by itself, I think.
can we still go over that again if people
You
want?
could, you
Right.
could, what you need to do is just, give it a title and a couple of sentence descriptions, and maybe post a resource you think people would read, and then people can decide if they want to do that. And those of us who are uncertain about it, we'll have to deal with that. So thanks everybody for coming, and probably our next meeting, I think we meet on the third Thursdays. So it's, I think, January 18th, maybe, or something along those lines, right, Sage? Something like that. I think it's the third Thursday in January. So happy
whatever that
holidays.
is.
Right.
Yeah, the 18th.
Happy holidays to everyone.
Have mindful holiday, folks. That's my greeting.
All right. Take
See
care,
you then.
everyone. Thanks for
Bye.
coming.